Today, we are joined by Dr. Yauheni Preiherman, who's the founder and director of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations, which aims to offer an open and geopolitically unbiased platform for research and discussion on international affairs and security in Eastern Europe. I think the most important line that you could stick in his bio for us is that he's a longtime contributor to the Jamestown Eurasia Daily Monitor. His pieces are always well received and always have an interesting and sort of thoughtful bent to how we should understand what's taking place in Eastern Europe and what's going on in Belarus. In 2021, he received his PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Warwick, where he focused on the foreign policy strategies of small states that sit in between centers of geopolitical gravity and have asymmetric relations with them. He's been widely published across a range of publications that I think accurately reflects Belarus's position in the world. Thank you for joining us today, Yauheni.
Thank you very much, Peter, for doing this, and thank you very much for a very kind introduction. I'm honored.
I think for many people in the West, Belarus is kind of swings between two poles in their understanding that probably have more to do with them than they do with Belarus's actual position. The first is this kind of view that Belarus is ripe for being carved off from Russia, that there's this desire for independence and it necessarily pushes Belarus in one way. And all of our policies have simply been screwing it up, this opportunity to carve Belarus off. Or that Belarus is a sort of an absolute Russian ally that's permanently tied itself to Moscow, and we shouldn't see any meaningful daylight between the two. And it's hard not to see this as kind of a neat dichotomy brought about by a little bit of analytic laziness, or maybe just being too pressed for time with too many other kind of large fires out in the world to actually give Belarus some actual time for thought, for research, for contemplation. And I think the theme for our conversation is really like, where does Belarus have agency? What are the choices that Lukashenko faces and for his successors? I mean, I recognize that these questions are a lot. I mean, you did a whole PhD on these themes. So I think we kind of have to work up to it a little bit. Earlier this week, we marked the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Russia of Ukraine. And in February 2022, Russian troops staged out of Belarus. However, it's not an active front today, and Belarus's role has changed. How would you describe how this evolution has taken place, how Minsk sees itself in the war, and are there discrepancies between the rhetoric and the behavior that we should be paying attention to?
I think that the third anniversary of the war is really a great way to start discussing Belarus and its role in regional security and geopolitics. First of all, because it explains in a practical way why Belarus really matters. Because if we compare Belarusian situational neutrality, that is to say, the position Belarus adhered to prior to 2020 in relation to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, when Belarus was the venue for peace talks and was emphatically away from the actual confrontation. So if we compare that position of situational neutrality to what happened in February 2022, once again, that just shows us on a very practical case why Belarus matters and what changed regional security in general, and in particular on the situation between Belarus and Ukraine it can make. What it also tells us about, and I think it is important, is that policy options and policy choices that the United States and more generally the West make in relation to Belarus, they have consequences beyond just the bilateral domain or beyond just the domestic situation in Belarus. Because while the West was introducing harsh economic sanctions and political pressure against Belarus starting at the end of 2020 in response to the presidential election, which were qualified in the West as non-democratic, and that necessitated, in the West opinion, this harsh response, no one really thought about the geopolitical or security consequences of those decisions. And then in February 2020, the whole world saw those consequences. That is why this is the first important thing to understand. Belarus matters, and also Western choices in regard to Belarus matter because they have consequences on the ground. Now, a little bit about how the Belarusian role or place in this conflict has evolved. So, indeed, in February 2022, when Russia started its campaign in Ukraine, part of Russian troops did enter the Ukrainian territory from the Belarusian territory. And they were there for a simple reason that a military exercise between Belarus and Russia had been taking place for a couple of weeks prior to that terrible news of February 2022. Of course, for the next several weeks, Russian troops were still there, but then immediately the Belarusian leadership, in my opinion, started looking for options how to ensure that it still can return at least partially to that situational neutrality stance. And it's not just out of, the reasons that it wanted to look good into someone's eyes, but because both Russia and Ukraine are two most fundamental partners and, neighboring countries for Belarus in terms of trade, but also in terms of the overall historical and cultural legacy. So it really does put Belarus, to put it very mildly, into an uncomfortable position to be. So the first attempt that the Belarusian leadership took was to somehow return its role as a negotiation peace venue. It didn't work out, even though 3 rounds of talks did take place in Belarus. And then the talks moved to Istanbul. This is where the Russians declared that they would pull away the troops from the Kiev strategic direction, which meant that they were returned to the Belarusian territory, and then from the Belarusian territory, they were moved back to Russia. This is an important chapter 1 in this entire development. Chapter 2 was connected to the missile attacks, which still took place from the Belarusian territory into Ukrainian territory, but they were also over around October 2022. And then the big question about the role of Belarus in all this was, why did those attacks happen? To the best of my knowledge, if I can read between the lines what is published publicly, but also something I know from behind the scenes, tells me that Minsk and Lukashenko personally came up with this argument, which was directed at the Russians, that it was in Moscow's own interest to have Belarus as a stable territory, stable country, meaning country which is not directly involved in fighting and which is not targeted by Ukrainians' counterattacks. Because in that capacity, Belarus could serve Russia better, because it could provide, for example, the industrial products which Russia had no longer access to due to the Western sanctions. So that's, from what I understand, that's how Minsk was making this argument, and that what explains to us why this Belarusian role in the entire situation changed. One last additional detail for our viewers to sort of understand the development. It is no secret that certain behind-the-scenes talks between Kiev and Minsk had taken place literally from day one of the war. And at different periods, I know that not only from the public realm, but from some other sources, pretty reliable ones, both Minsk and Kiev were satisfied with the way that discussion unfolded. It wasn't about any major, breakthroughs or any major plans to change the entire course of the war, of course, but that was about ensuring that on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border, risks are as reduced as possible, military risk, first of all, and that the sides understand each other's moves. It's been not that easy to keep that balance, but I think so far so good. So in this respect, it also tells us that Belarus really made an effort to stay away from a more closer involvement in this fighting, which is important for the fighting itself, for the regional situation, but also for Belarus, because it does reflect the majority of Belarusians' views.
I think your writing for EDM in 2023 and 2024 reflected some of these dynamics, and I'd recommend Yauheni's pieces for an understanding at the time that it was taking place, what was going on and what seemed to be some of the decision making there. So, what role do you think official Minsk sees for Belarus in peace talks now that we're seeing a variety of different ways in which the United States is trying to sort of force a negotiation? We have some very distinct and very different conditions from Ukraine and from Russia about what peace could look like. Where does the Belarusian government see itself in these talks, or in ending the war in a meaningful way rather than just a temporary ceasefire? Like why would Belarusian involvement be important to the leadership?
Well, indeed, the Belarus involvement would be important to the leadership and to the country, I would argue. And this is the most important thing to stress here. So it might sound a little bit strange, but in the first place, what I think Minsk wants to achieve is just to have a seat at a negotiation table. By the way, it's more or less the same thing we keep hearing from other European nations, especially in recent weeks when the Trump administration started to reach out bilaterally to the Russians, and a lot of Europeans are asking whether there might be any place for themselves at the negotiation table. In this respect, I think the logic that Minsk has and the logic that drives this questioning from other European nations is the same. No matter what exactly is going to be discussed and what turns the negotiation might take, in the first place, these countries, including Belarus, want to ensure that they sit there and they represent their own interests. Because, of course, you can say, oh, we have allies, so the Americans can say, we don't need Europeans there because they are our allies, so we'll represent their voice. And people in Russia can say, why have Belarus? Because we are allied, we'll talk on their behalf. But I think when we are dealing with a situation like this, when it's not just about this ceasefire, at least hopefully and potentially, it's about a broader discussion, long-term one, strategically meaningful about the future arrangement of European security. It's, in my view, super important that every nation can have a seat there and represent its interests, because there is simply no way that anyone else will represent those interests in an equal way. So this is, let's say, a functional need and a functional desire that Belarus has. In terms of the contents, of course, Belarus is pretty small in terms of its size, but also, to the conflict itself. And that is why it can hardly hope to impose any agenda of its own. But I think what will be important for Belarus, and again, for many other European nations, is to ensure that if there is a peace deal, there are all those guarantees and all those elements that will ensure this is a long-term guarantee. Because for any small state in international affairs, especially ones like Belarus, which sits in this very complicated and tricky geopolitical environment, the best guarantee for its own security is that it does not face an immediate threat, especially in the military realm. So I'm sure Belarus, whether in whatever form it takes place in the negotiation, will be advancing this very line. We need a long-term settlement, and we need some rules of the game. Ideally, that should be something returning the European continent to this all overarching system of European security, like, in 1991, Helsinki first, then Paris Charter. I'm not saying that exactly the same principles would be there, but something of the kind. But, realistically, I don't think it's really possible to hope that such an arrangement might result from the conversations and negotiations in the nearest future. That is why I think the hope will be on the Belarusian side, just to ensure that there are certain agreements, especially regulating the behavior of states on this border between Belarus and Poland, Belarus and the Baltic states, that will ensure that risks are minimized and that the country, which does not really have a lot of economic resources to spend on the military domain, could concentrate on the economy rather than on what deterrence might require.
So to think about some of these arrangements that Belarus has entered into that, whether explicitly or implicitly address some of the security concerns that Belarus would have, how should we understand the union state? Because this is one of those concepts that's obviously fundamental to understanding how Minsk deals with Moscow, but it's not necessarily well understood except by a handful of specialists here in the United States. And it's at this point it's a little over 25 years old. So how is it evolved over those years? Like what is the manifestation of it today that makes it still an important concept for understanding this, how Minsk manages the relationship?
Well, first of all, indeed, the very concept of the Union State has been so much misinterpreted and misunderstood in the West for so long. And I think it's important to stress that, because especially prior to 2020, when the dynamic between Belarus and Russia, and generally the dynamic in Belarusian foreign policy, was a little bit different from what it is today, I think a better understanding of the Union States on the Western part would have helped to make better decisions for Western governments. And in particular, one thing which was important to understand, but was widely misinterpreted, was sort of the nature of that relationship between Belarus and Russia within the framework of the Union State. This is a unique framework. You will hardly find something similar in the rest of the world, which of course tells you a little bit about the very special nature of the bilateral relationship between Minsk and Moscow. And that spreads across all the domains of cooperation. Suffice to say, within the Union State, there is a strong defense component. And some elements of that defense components are loose, but others, especially due to recent decisions, and we can talk about that a little bit later, are becoming really, big deal, really serious, in many respects comparable to Article 5 within North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But what has always been important within this Union State is that if you read the text of the treaty signed in 1999, sort of the thread which goes along all the articles there is that it's still a state-to-state organization. There are still elements at different levels of decision-making that the treaty foresees, which should ensure that unless Belarus agrees to something, this cannot happen. For example, there are decision-making procedures at the level of governments, but then if governments adopt something preliminarily, which Minsk still disagrees with, then the president of Belarus can always block it, because at the level of presidents, it's sort of an equal relationship, even though, of course, when you compare Belarus to Russia, these are two very different countries, to put it mildly, right, in terms of their size, military, political might, and economic possibilities. So this is very important. But of course, the last 5 years have, contributed to quite some additional dynamic within the Union State. Whereas prior to 2020, Minsk was really opposed to certain new steps within the integration process, which Minsk was saying could potentially threaten its sovereignty over long term. For example, when it comes to economic cooperation and how that cooperation is regulated, what kind of regulatory standards are applied, whether those standards are sort of a little bit of Belarusian ones, a little bit of Russian ones, and something from the international experience, or just Belarus exceeds to exist in Russian standards. So that kind of discussion. After 2020, with those massive Western sanctions, which were basically pushing Belarus further into Russia's embrace, it was, of course, difficult for Belarus to say no to certain things. And that explains why the so-called roadmaps of integration started to be adopted and implemented quicker. It also, I think, explains why in the security realm, Belarus and Russia have now signed additional agreements. For example, very recently, an agreement on security guarantees. But even with that security guarantees agreement, by the way, it is still important to note, and I think a lot of analysts misread it, it still contains certain safeguards for Belarus to ensure that this is a state-to-state integration process. And if there is something which is completely unacceptable for Belarus, it can stop those decisions, both at the procedural level, but also, if it wants, at the political level, by taking some less straightforward decisions. So to summarize what I've just said, I think over the last 25 years, we've seen this really interesting, in terms of being unique project, evolve, especially in the last 5 years, where in light of Western sanctions, there's been an acceleration of integration. But it is still a situation where in this close integration, Belarus does have those levers to ensure that its most fundamental interests are respected, and Russia cannot unilaterally impose certain decisions. Of course, if we continue in the same way like in the 5 last years, where Belarus simply has no room for maneuver geopolitically, then anything might happen. In the future, the Union State might be something leading towards basically not a unification of the states, but essentially Belarus becoming sort of a backyard of Russia in all possible respects. But then there is another scenario as well, and it will depend on Belarusian choices. But as I said in the beginning, it will also depend a lot on Western choices towards Belarus and towards Eastern Europe.
So to bring in something we haven't discussed just yet, and that's the other side of the Eurasian landmass. Jamestown spends a lot of time trying to understand sort of Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, the Caucasus, and the like. But we also spend a great deal of time trying to understand what the People's Republic of China is doing. And as I recall, we have new sort of free trade agreements last year on sort of different aspects of trade between Belarus and China. That China is now, I think, the second largest trading partner for Belarus. So how should we look at this relationship? Is this something that Minsk is trying to use to hedge against Russia? Should we see it as a triangular relationship? Should it be something that's sort of two bilateral relationships that are operating in completely different sort of ways and rules and norms? Or, kind of how should we how should we take this sort of unique development and then, put it up next to where Belarus finds itself in the security environment?
Hmm. Well, first of all, Belarus-China relations is certainly something very bilateral and different from Belarus-Russia relations. I don't think there is any way to see that triangular relationship, even though very often the three countries might have, at least politically, common positions on certain geopolitical developments in the world or in a specific area. So those are clearly two bilateral relations. And the reason why Belarus has been so proactive in trying to advance its cooperation with China in all possible realms is, of course, because its foreign policy is still governed by this idea of, well, hedging, if you like, or just to simplify it, the need to diversify. And I think that's something which the Trump administration people would call, to use their vocabulary, common sense, because if a country needs or wants to be sovereign and to ensure that over longer term, it does not make itself, excessively dependent on a third country, then of course it has to look for diversification. Prior to 2020, the European Union and the United States were the main target in that respect, the main partners where Belarus wanted diversification. And for example, that reflected itself in this official formula that the Belarusian government demanded that the government itself and its representatives implement the 30-30-30 formula in foreign trade, and especially in Belarusian exports. The idea was that it should be balanced. 30% should go to Russia, 30% should go to the West, and then the rest 30% to other countries in the world. Of course, with the sanctions, and you see, I keep returning to this thing with the Western sanctions because geopolitically it has had a huge impact and huge consequence, not so much in terms of achieving what those Western sanctions were proclaimed to be for. Just on the contrary, all those goals have been a fiasco. But in terms of changing the geopolitical environment, a logic for Belarusian foreign policy. So as soon as the Western dimension became unavailable as a potential source of diversification, Belarus doubled down on its efforts to advance relations with China bilaterally, especially in terms of economy and Belarusian own exports, but also multilaterally. Belarus became really enthusiastic about joining those organizations where China is a leading partner, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So now Belarus has become the first European member of that organization, but also BRICS, for example. Belarus is still in the waiting room, so it wasn't allowed to join last year, but still aspirations are there. And one can say, oh, look, but it's not just China. Russia is also there. So how much of a difference does it make in terms of diversification? But I would argue it does make a lot of difference, because this is sort of a smart Belarusian way to diversify, when diversification does not necessarily mean that you need to ostracize the second other, who is basically the reason why you want to diversify. And in this respect, because Russia and China have had in recent years this sort of positive relationship, by the way, we don't know how exactly that relationship is going to evolve. That's an interesting separate question. But because that's been pretty positive, I think in a way it even helped Belarus to look for diversification. But of course, having said all this, it's enough to take a look at the map and understand that still China, in terms of diversification opportunities and geostrategic opportunities for Belarus, is still something different than the European Union and the West. right? It's just, again, the West is something we border on, and China's a bit far away. But still, in the absence of that opportunity with the West, yeah, as I said, Belarus has been trying to double down on the Chinese direction.
So really, really quickly then, to last week you talked about Minsk in Eurasia Daily Monitor. You talked about Minsk's effort to sort of reset a relationship with the United States or signal that there was an openness to seeing some sort of change. What what do you think is possible in that change? Right, there are certain things that sort of irrevocably, if you will, tie um, Belarus to Russia. That's not just geography, right? It's the nuclear plant and how
Mm-hmm.
they're going to have to work with Russia on keeping that plant fueled and functional, for decades into the future. We can imagine things about the infrastructure and the sort of the connectivity. But what are those things? If all of a sudden diversification to the West were possible, what would that mean? If there were, how would Belarus make the case that the sanctions could be lifted, and if they were lifted, this is sort of a meaningful future that could be there.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I think we need to understand that when we talk about Belarusian diversification of foreign policy, there is no way that in Belarusian minds this diversification could or should lead to some kind of breakup with Russia. This is a very different story. So we shouldn't apply, let's say, Ukrainian model of thinking about these geopolitical dimensions to Belarusian thinking. And it's, I'd argue it's not just the Lukashenko government. It's something which comes a little bit from in between, from inside the society and the thinking, which is even cultural in a way. That is why Peter, rightly pointed out in the very beginning of our discussion that the Western discourse in Belarus has often been flawed by those expectations that, perhaps we can now somehow drag Belarus away from Russia, or on the contrary, we should stop talking about Belarus because they are so close with Russia. So yes, this is a very specific case, and it's going to be specific, but diversification and possible rapprochement with the West and the United States in particular could have important strategic opportunities and benefits to both Belarus as a sovereign state, because obviously it needs this diversification, needs to restore relations with the West in some form and shape, but also for the West, because as we said previously, Belarus matters, including in regional security. It also matters as the closest ally to Russia, who has access to, I would say, unique understanding of the Kremlin. So it could help the West in that respect as well. What is possible under these conditions? Well, this is a 1 million question, of course. I don't think that we should be under the illusion that the situation could return rather quickly to the status quo ante. In other words, to what it looked like prior to 2020. I don't think there is a way there, because business as usual is not possible for both the West and Belarus. But what is possible, though, including under these present conditions, is for Belarus and the West to agree on a positive agenda when it comes to regional security, and the little but still important contribution that Belarus can make there, including by providing for transparency and military reduction risks on the border between Belarus and NATO countries, and also economically. I think, due to Belarusian logistical and transportation position, geographic position, it does play a crucial role, including for, processes broader than just Eastern Europe. Whatever we look at the cooperation between, for example, Asian countries, including China, and Western countries, including Europe, Belarus is somehow at the heart of that process. So there has to be some arrangement to ensure that there is stability, and I think this is possible. Whether it's possible to achieve anything quickly, well, a good question. Of course, the United States can drive the process, but because of the very harsh positions of certain countries like Lithuania, for example, Latvia, on relations with Belarus, I don't think that quick progress is possible. And it's not just because the Lithuanians or Latvians do not want to cooperate with Belarus. It's also because Belarus, unfortunately, has somehow fallen victim to their more strategic thinking. Because for them to accept that it is now okay to defreeze relations with Belarus would amount to basically accepting that the threat coming from Russia is getting down. And obviously, under the present circumstances, it's not exactly something which they want to have, the discussion they want to have. So it's a complicated situation, but I think things are possible, and they are possible because they are certainly going to be beneficial. The last 5 years showed that the policy of maximum pressure and economic sanctions, it doesn't achieve goals which were stated, and it has a lot of unintended consequences, which are bad for Belarus, but also bad for the Western regional security.
So, Jamestown's mission really is about trying to understand other countries in their own words and in their own terms. So, how would you describe maybe the three big decisions that Lukashenko and other Belarusian leaders see for themselves, kind of, maybe this year, next year? Like, what I think this is a good place for us to go out on. Of like, well, what are those choices? Like, what agency do the leaders see for themselves, and where do they think they're going to have to face some strategic dilemmas that are, they can't just keep avoiding? Like, what are those big questions or choices that you think Minsk sees going ahead?
Wow, that's a really tough question with the choices. Look, I think that at least in two very obvious realms, Belarus is facing strategic choices and strategic actions to be undertaken in the years to come. I don't know whether it's just for this year. The first one is domestic. It's pretty obvious that the Belarusian government and Lukashenko himself have launched something which we might call a transition. So that's a separate topic, of course, but very briefly, there's been a change of constitution which foresees clear steps forward for the system to change from the super presidential to something else. Of course, a lot will depend now on how exactly this is implemented. So those decisions are facing Lukashenko personally and the Belarusian elites in more general term. And then secondly, everything which has to do with regional security, the war between Russia and Ukraine, how it ends, but even more so, what it means for the future of European security order or European security arrangement. And I think here, because this is so important for Belarus, Lukashenko and his people will be ready to engage in flexible discussions and even take decisions where they will need to make certain, points directed not necessarily for the present, but for the future. In other words, where they will be eager to find common ground with NATO countries, even with their neighbors like Poland and Lithuania, who have been not the friendliest countries for the Lukashenko government in recent years. So I do see potential there, but important to understand that potential will only be possible and shaped by broader development. So in this respect, it's not just Belarus which predetermines what exactly is going to do. It's in many respects the situation and the structural development in the region that will shape those outcomes to a serious extent.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to reading your next piece in your Ridge Daily Monitor. And thank you for sharing your perspective on what's taking place in Belarus and how to understand sort of the ways in which the country's government sort of sees itself and is looking ahead at sort of really, the next 6 months, year, but it's certainly a bigger strategic picture.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you to you and your team for your continued interest and support of professional analysis when it comes to Belarus.